They told him to be calm. They told him to be patient. They told him that justice would come someday if he only remained peaceful, silent, and obedient. But Malcolm X asked a question that still echoes today. How can a government that uses force across the world demand restraint from those it oppresses at home? This story begins with that contradiction. Across history, powerful nations have defended their interests with overwhelming force on distant lands, in foreign conflicts, in the name of order and security. Yet when Black Americans demanded basic rights, dignity, and safety, they were told that even self-protection was unacceptable. Malcolm X did not accept this logic. He exposed it calmly, clearly, relentlessly. In his final days, Malcolm X stood at a crossroads between truth and comfort. He chose truth. He challenged not only political power, but also the narratives that shaped public opinion. He questioned why suffering communities were expected to endure quietly, while the same system justified force whenever its own interests were threatened. His words were not about chaos, they were about honesty, about naming reality as it was, not as it was presented. This is not just a historical speech. It is a mirror held up to power, to media, and to society itself. Malcolm's final message forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Who defines peace? Who decides when force is justified? And why is the right to self-preservation framed so differently depending on who demands it? In this video, we revisit Malcolm X's last speech not to sensationalize it, but to understand it, to listen closely, to separate what he actually said from what history often claims he meant. If you value stories that challenge official narratives, uncover uncomfortable truths, and preserve voices that refuse to be silenced, support this channel. Like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. The conversation does not end here. It begins just one night before he stood at the podium. Malcolm X had watched the thin line between survival and silence burn away. In the darkness of Queens, his home was attacked while his family slept inside, his wife pregnant, his children still small enough to be carried. Smoke filled the rooms where laughter had once lived, and flames tore through walls meant to shelter, not threaten. It was not an abstract warning or a distant rumor. It was personal, immediate, and unmistakably clear. Yet when morning came, Malcolm did not retreat. He did not soften his words or dilute his message. Instead, he stepped forward with a steadiness that revealed something deeper than courage, conviction rooted in responsibility. This moment cannot be separated from the contradiction he had already exposed. A society that justified force in defense of power now expected restraint from a man whose family had nearly been taken from him. The same voices that spoke of order and patience offered no protection when danger arrived at his door. Malcolm understood what that silence meant. He understood that dignity, once surrendered, is rarely returned voluntarily. And so, standing before an audience less than 24 hours after his life had been threatened, he made a choice that would define his legacy, not as one of fear, but of resolve. He spoke not as someone untouched by consequence, but as someone who had weighed it carefully. His words carried the weight of a father who knew his children were watching not only from a distance, but across time. He believed that what the next generation inherited would depend on whether this one chose comfort or principle. To remain silent would have been safer in the moment, but far more dangerous in the long run. Silence teaches submission. It teaches young minds that survival is earned by shrinking. Malcolm rejected that lesson entirely. What made his resolve extraordinary was not anger, but clarity. He did not speak from panic or desperation. He spoke with calm purpose, grounded in the belief that dignity must be defended first in thought, then in action, and always with discipline. He understood that oppression does not only rely on force, it relies on fear becoming habit, on exhaustion becoming acceptance, By standing firm so soon after the attack, Malcolm disrupted the process. He refused to allow intimidation to become the final word. This was not defiance for its own sake. It was a moral stance shaped by history and sharpened by experience. Malcolm had seen how movements lose their soul when they abandon their people to protect their image. He had seen how carefully managed progress often leaves the most vulnerable exactly where they began. And he knew that future generations would not ask how polite their predecessors had been, but whether they had been honest, whether they had been brave, and whether they had refused to pass inherited injustice forward unchanged. In that room, Malcolm did more than continue a speech. He modeled a standard. He showed that dignity is not an abstract idea discussed safely after the danger has passed. It is a principle tested precisely when the risk is real. His presence alone became a lesson that standing firm does not require hatred, only self-respect, and that responsibility to the future sometimes demands discomfort in the present. The attack on his home was meant to send a message. Malcolm answered it without raising his voice, without retreating from truth, and without asking permission to remain human. In doing, he reminded everyone listening that movements are not sustained by slogans, but by people willing to stand upright when fear offers an easier path. What he gave that night was not just a continuation of his message, but proof of it, a living example that dignity, once claimed, must be protected, not only for oneself, but for all who come after. After confronting the threat at his own doorstep and refusing to retreat into silence, Malcolm X widened the lens of the conversation. He no longer spoke only of what was happening in American cities or southern streets, but of a much larger pattern that stretched across oceans and continents. The struggle he described was not confined to one country or one community. It was part of a global awakening, a shared resistance against systems that had long fed on imbalance and control. By placing the Black American experience within this broader movement, Malcolm transformed what many saw as a domestic issue into a chapter of world history still being written. He asked his listeners to look beyond borders and flags and to recognize how power actually functioned. Nations that presented themselves as separate, even competing, were often aligned when it came to preserving their economic and political dominance. Whether in Africa, Asia, Latin America, or in black neighborhoods within the United States, the same logic repeated itself. Access to resources flowed upward, while hardship was pushed downward. Malcolm did not describe this as coincidence or failure, but as design. The names of governments might change, but the structure remained familiar, disciplined, and remarkably consistent. This perspective gave new meaning to the events unfolding at home. When people in Africa demanded control over their land and labor, they were described as unstable or dangerous. When communities in the Caribbean or Southeast Asia pushed back against external control, they were framed as threats to order. Malcolm saw that Black Americans were spoken about in the same language. The labels differed in tone, but not in purpose. Each served to justify intervention, surveillance, and suppression, while presenting power as neutral and resistance as unreasonable. By drawing these connections, Malcolm challenged the isolation that often weakens movements. He understood that people are easier to manage when they believe their suffering is unique or self-inflicted. Linking Black America to global anti-colonial struggles broke that illusion. It revealed that the same forces shaping life in Harlem or Detroit were influencing villages, ports, and capitals thousands of miles away. This recognition was not meant to foster despair, but clarity. Clarity, he believed, was the first step toward genuine solidarity. Malcolm's global framing also reframed responsibility. If exploitation operated internationally, then dignity and resistance could not remain narrowly defined. He encouraged his audience to see themselves not as a minority pleading for inclusion, but as part of a majority of humanity seeking balance and respect. This shift altered the emotional center of the struggle. It replaced isolation with connection and replaced apology with awareness. The fight was no longer about asking for acceptance within an existing system, but about questioning the system itself. What made this vision powerful was how naturally it followed from his earlier message. Having already exposed the contradiction between global force and domestic restraint, Malcolm now revealed its scale. The same mindset that justified intervention abroad also shaped inequality at home. Once seen together, these realities could no longer be dismissed as separate problems requiring separate solutions. They were expressions of a single structure that rewarded control and punished challenge. In telling this story, Malcolm did not offer slogans or easy conclusions. He offered perspective. He asked his listeners to recognize that history was moving, that old empires were being questioned, and that people long described as powerless were discovering their voice. To understand the moment, he argued, was to understand that dignity was not a gift granted by authority, but a condition claimed through awareness and unity. By situating Black America within a global movement for self-determination, Malcolm gave his message both depth and direction. He showed that what was at stake was larger than reform and deeper than policy. It was about how humanity organizes itself, whose lives are valued, and whether those who have been shaped by history would continue to accept roles written without their consent. As Malcolm X expanded the struggle beyond borders and revealed the global structure of exploitation, he knew another misunderstanding had to be confronted directly. His critics were quick to reduce his message to a single accusation, claiming that his refusal to accept passivity meant he encouraged chaos. Malcolm addressed this distortion carefully, because he understood how easily truth could be reshaped once it passed through hostile ears. What he offered was not a call for disorder, but a disciplined argument for self-preservation in a world where danger was neither random nor imagined. He drew a clear line between aggression and defense, a line often blurred by those who benefited from confusion. Malcolm spoke as someone who recognized that fear, when left unmanaged, becomes a tool of control. Communities living under constant threat are not kept in line by laws alone, but by the expectation that resistance will only make things worse. Against that logic, he offered another way of thinking. The right to protect one's life, family, and community was not a radical idea to him. It was a basic human principle applied unevenly depending on who invoked it. This argument followed naturally from everything he had already exposed. If powerful nations justified force to protect their interests, and if global systems acted in concert to maintain control, then denying the same instinct to those at the bottom was not morality, but strategy. Malcolm refused to accept a standard where restraint was demanded only from the vulnerable. He insisted that dignity could not survive if it depended entirely on the goodwill of those who had shown none. What mattered most to him was structure. He did not speak of reaction driven by impulse or anger. He emphasized organization, clarity, and purpose. To defend oneself was not to abandon principles, but to enforce them when they were ignored. Without discipline, resistance collapses into chaos. Without readiness, communities remain exposed. Malcolm believed that true stability came not from submission, but from balance, where harm was no longer one-sided and accountability became unavoidable. He also understood how language could be weaponized. The moment a person claimed the right to stand firm, the narrative often shifted, painting defense as threat and caution as extremism. Malcolm warned that this reversal was intentional. By redefining self-protection as wrongdoing, those in power could maintain the appearance of order while allowing injustice to continue uninterrupted. His response was not to shout louder, but to speak more precisely, stripping away the false equivalence between harm inflicted and harm resisted. This clarity carried moral weight. Malcolm was not arguing that conflict was desirable, but that pretending danger did not exist was far more destructive. He had already seen what happened when communities were told to endure quietly, to wait indefinitely, to place their faith in promises that never matured into protection. self-defense, in his view, was not about dominating others, but about ending the expectation of victimhood. It was about making dignity non-negotiable. By framing self-defense as organized and justified, Malcolm also rejected isolation. He believed individuals acting alone were vulnerable, easily misunderstood, and easily targeted. Collective awareness and preparation, however, created resilience. It transformed fear into responsibility and panic into planning. This approach aligned with his broader vision of unity, not just within neighborhoods, but across movements that shared similar experiences of marginalization and control. In the end, Malcolm's clarification was an act of preservation, not provocation. He sought to protect both people and principles from being eroded by distortion. His message was that peace built on imbalance is fragile, and stability enforced by fear is temporary. Only when communities are secure enough to stand upright can dialogue become honest and lasting. Within the larger arc of his final days, this insistence on disciplined self-defense was not a contradiction of his humanity, but an affirmation of it. It reflected a belief that life has value precisely because it is worth protecting, and that dignity, once recognized, demands more than patience. It demands responsibility, awareness, and the courage to refuse roles written by those who benefit from silence. After insisting on the right to disciplined self-defense, Malcolm X turned his attention to a force he believed was just as powerful as any weapon: the story being told about the struggle itself. He understood that control was not maintained only through laws or physical pressure, but through perception. Long before action was judged, the narrative had already shaped who would be seen as reasonable and who would be treated as a threat. For Malcolm, this was where much of the real damage occurred, quietly and consistently, in headlines, broadcasts, and carefully selected images. He observed how black communities were rarely presented as complex or human, but instead reduced to symbols of disorder. Statistics were lifted from their context and repeated until they hardened into identity. Isolated incidents became defining traits, while the conditions that produced them were left unexplored. In this framing, poverty appeared as personal failure rather than structural neglect, and tension looked like inherent instability rather than a response to pressure. Malcolm recognized this pattern as deliberate, not accidental. A community labeled dangerous becomes easier to monitor, easier to restrict, and easier to dismiss when harm follows. What troubled him most was how this narrative reversal worked. When injustice occurred, the focus often shifted away from the act itself and toward the reaction. Attention lingered on broken windows instead of broken lives, on disruption rather than the causes behind it. In this way, those who endured harm were subtly transformed into the source of it. Malcolm warned that once this shift was accepted, accountability dissolved. Authority no longer needed to explain its actions, because the story had already assigned blame elsewhere. This manipulation fit seamlessly into the larger structure he had been describing. A system that justified force on a global scale required public consent, and that consent depended on belief. The media, in his view, functioned as the translator between power and the public, shaping how events were understood before questions could even be asked. By repeating certain images and omitting others, it trained audiences to see some lives as inherently suspect and others as naturally protected. Over time, these impressions became reflexive, rarely challenged and deeply embedded. Malcolm was particularly concerned with how this affected internal understanding. When people are surrounded by negative portrayals long enough, they begin to measure themselves against them. Doubt replaces confidence, and isolation replaces unity. He believed this was one of the most effective tools of control, because it required no visible force. A divided community, unsure of its own worth, polices itself more efficiently than any external authority ever could. Yet Malcolm did not speak of this to inspire bitterness. His purpose was awareness. He wanted people to recognize the pattern so they could step outside of it. Once the mechanism was visible, it lost much of its power. Seeing how narratives were constructed made it possible to question them, and questioning them opened space for self-definition. He urged his listeners not to accept descriptions written by those who had no stake in their dignity. This critique of the media also reinforced his insistence on organization and clarity. If stories could be twisted so easily, then messages had to be deliberate and disciplined. Confusion only benefited those who thrived on misrepresentation. Malcolm believed that reclaiming narrative control was as important as any other form of resistance, because it determined how actions would be remembered and whether truth would survive distortion. In the final days of his life, this warning carried added weight. He knew that once voices like his were removed, interpretation would follow. History would be edited, softened in some places and sharpened in others, until the original intent was difficult to recognize. By exposing the mechanics of narrative manipulation, Malcolm left behind more than a critique. He left a guide for reading power critically. Within the flow of his final message, this moment completed the circle. He had addressed force, responsibility, global context, and self-defense. Now he addressed meaning itself, without control over the story. Even the most just struggle could be turned against itself. And so, he reminded his audience that liberation required not only courage in action, but vigilance in understanding, because the battle for dignity is fought as much in the mind as it is in the world. After dismantling the narratives imposed from the outside, Malcolm X turned to a danger he believed was even more subtle, because it wore the appearance of progress. He warned that not every sign of advancement represented real change, and that some of the most celebrated victories were carefully designed to leave the underlying structure untouched. To him, tokenism was not a misunderstanding, it was a strategy. By elevating a small number of individuals into visible positions, the system could claim improvement while the everyday reality for the majority remained unchanged. Malcolm spoke from long observation. He had watched how a single appointment, a headline, or a photograph could be used as evidence that a problem was being solved. These moments were repeated until they drowned out the broader picture. Meanwhile, housing conditions stayed crowded, schools remained underfunded, and economic opportunity continued to bypass entire neighborhoods. The contrast was not accidental. Symbolic inclusion created a sense of motion without requiring transformation, allowing those in power to point upward while the foundation below quietly eroded. What troubled Malcolm most was how this illusion affected internal judgment. When progress was measured by proximity to established power, success became individual rather than collective. The few who crossed certain thresholds were encouraged to see themselves as exceptions rather than representatives. In doing, they were often separated from the very communities whose struggles had made their visibility meaningful. Malcolm did not question their intelligence or ambition. He questioned the role they were placed in. Once elevated, they were expected to reassure rather than challenge, to interpret hardship as temporary rather than structural. This pattern fit seamlessly into the larger system Malcolm had already described. Just as global power structures maintained control by appearing fragmented, domestic inequality was softened by selective visibility. The presence of a few faces in high places became proof that the door was open, even if most were still locked outside. Malcolm understood how this narrative reduced pressure for change. If progress could be symbolized, it no longer needed to be delivered at scale. He also warned that tokenism distorted accountability. When individuals were positioned as spokespeople, their success was used to speak over unresolved suffering. Discontent could then be dismissed as impatience or ingratitude. The focus shifted from conditions to attitudes, from systems to personalities. Malcolm believed this redirection was dangerous because it redirected anger away from structures and toward individuals, weakening unity and exhausting momentum. For Malcolm, real progress had a clear measure. It improved the lives of the many, not the image of the few. Dignity could not be rationed without consequence. He rejected the idea that there existed a separate class untouched by shared struggle, because experience had shown him that visibility did not equal security. No matter how polished the image, vulnerability remained when the foundation beneath it was unstable. This recognition reinforced his insistence on collective solutions rooted in shared conditions, not selective access. His critique was not driven by resentment, but by realism. He understood that systems rarely dismantle themselves voluntarily. They adapt, absorb, and rebrand. Tokenism allowed injustice to survive behind a mask of progress, persuading the public that patience was still required while urgency quietly faded. Malcolm challenged his audience to look past appearances and ask harder questions about who truly benefited from change and who remained waiting. In the broader flow of his final message, this rejection of symbolic advancement completed another layer of clarity. He had already exposed global exploitation, defended the right to self-preservation, and revealed how narratives were manipulated. Now he confronted the comfort of partial victories. By doing, he insisted that liberation could not be measured by exceptions, but by conditions, and that any movement satisfied with symbols would eventually lose sight of its purpose. Malcolm's warning remains unsettling because it demands honesty. It asks whether progress is being celebrated because it is real, or because it is convenient. And it reminds us that justice delayed for the many cannot be excused by opportunity granted to the few. In the final moments of his message, Malcolm X brought everything together with striking clarity. After exposing hypocrisy, confronting fear, challenging false narratives, and rejecting symbolic progress, he returned to what he believed was the only path forward: unity rooted in awareness, organization guided by purpose, and resistance shaped by strategy rather than impulse. For Malcolm, freedom was never an individual achievement. It was a collective condition, built when people refused to remain isolated, divided, or passive in the face of systems designed to weaken them. He warned that division was not accidental. It was cultivated. Communities fractured along lines of status, ideology, and fear were easier to manage and easier to mislead. Malcolm understood that unity did not mean uniformity, but alignment around shared interests and shared realities. Without unity, even justified demands could be neutralized. Without organization, anger could burn bright and then disappear without leaving change behind. And without strategy, courage could be wasted instead of transformed into lasting power. What he called for was not reckless confrontation, but intelligent resistance. Resistance that understood timing, structure, and consequence. Resistance that refused to be reactive, choosing instead to be deliberate. Malcolm believed that when people organized themselves economically, politically, and socially, they shifted the balance of power. They were no longer waiting to be acknowledged. They were asserting presence. In that shift, dignity became practice, not theory. At the heart of his final message was a rejection of passivity. Malcolm believed that systems of injustice survived not only through force, but through resignation. When people were convinced they had no alternatives, compliance followed naturally. His words challenged that internal surrender. He reminded his listeners that history moved when ordinary people decided that endurance was no longer enough. That decision, once made collectively, changed what was possible. Even as danger closed in around him, Malcolm spoke with discipline rather than despair. His focus was not on himself, but on what would remain after he was gone. He knew that voices could be silenced, but ideas rooted in shared experience were far harder to erase. His call for unity was ultimately a call for continuity, for a movement that could survive individuals and withstand pressure without losing direction. When his life was taken just days later, The urgency of his final words became unmistakable. Yet his message did not end there. It continues wherever people question appearances, refuse false comfort, and choose cooperation over fragmentation. His legacy is not found in myth or slogans, but in the ongoing effort to turn awareness into action and conviction into structure. Thank you for listening to this story and for taking the time to engage with ideas that still challenge, provoke, and demand reflection. If you found value in revisiting Malcolm X's final message and believe voices like his deserve to be remembered and understood in full, support this work by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Together, we keep these conversations alive and ensure that the lessons of the past continue to inform the struggles of the present and the possibilities of the future.